Thanks for joining us today. And we are going to be talking about not just investment strategies, but whether you own a business yourself or whether you're thinking of joining a business, how you might think of alternative revenue or remuneration options so that a startup company can afford high-end talent, for example. So we're going to go through a number of different aspects and ways you can do something like that, and really start from start a new business, if you will. But before I jump into that, I wanted to remind you all that the SBDC has a lot of great business resources, especially for COVID-19 issues, and we have links here. This presentation is available, so you can actually get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation with all the embedded links. You just need to contact the New Mexico SBDC, and they will be happy to give you a copy of the presentation. My name is Larry Donahue. I'm an attorney. I've been an attorney for almost 30 years, not quite, I think 27 or 28 years. I primarily deal with intellectual property and business. And we are going to talk about some very interesting business issues today. So what we're going to talk about today is what I call the startup dilemma. And specifically, most startups, unless you have a lot of cash, it's hard to find good talent. It's hard to produce a sellable product or service. And so how do you start up a company with only a little bit of cash and yet be able to obtain good talent? And we're going to talk about that. And specifically, what kind of non-cash payment options are available for companies, startup companies. But it doesn't have to be startup companies, but usually it's startup companies that have this issue to obtain good talent. The training objectives here is, one, how to acquire good talent, great talent, without necessarily having bucket loads of cash, and understanding the different non-cash options available for businesses. And in order to do that, you really need to understand how people sort of think about and evaluate risk when it comes to considering spending their time, their resources on a new company or startup. And so I'm going to really try and talk from two different sides of this fence here, one from the business side and then the other side being the talent, whether it's a web developer or photographer or business strategist or sales executive or somebody else. Now, before I finally dive in, I do have to remind you that I am a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. And while I'm going to give legal advice, NMSBDC is not a law firm and cannot give legal advice. So you really need to view this presentation as just general advice and not legal advice. And the reason this is important is I'm going to give you a lot of generalities, but there's always exceptions to the rule. So whatever I say on this presentation today, there could be reasons why what I'm saying is not true or maybe not applicable to your specific business. So you really do need to take this with a grain of salt and talk to a professional if you want to go forward with some of this. With all of that said, let's start. And the first issue I want to discuss is what I'm calling the startup dilemma. And, how do you produce a competitive offering with little money? And how do you find the right talent to help you when you don't have the ability to pay the talent? And, a lot of people say, well, I'll obtain funding or I'll find investors. And you can certainly do that, but I'm going to tell you, most investors want to see a competitive offering. They just don't want to invest in thin air, because if you're asking an investor to invest in thin air, what are you really asking the investor to do? Invest in you. And so who the heck are you? Are you just somebody with a great idea? Or are you a former NASA rocket scientist and you found out that there's a certain way to make a certain O-ring on very specific NASA rockets? Then, maybe that's a different story, but most people aren't in that scenario. So you really need to think through the startup dilemma and, either obtaining the money or finding the talent to get that competitive offering. And, really, it's all about talent. And if you as a business owner are going to start a business, you are part of the talent, of course. I'm a lawyer. I'm also an internet guy and a web developer and an engineer. So I have some talent to build software, but because I'm a lawyer, I'm very busy and my time is limited. So I really have to hire third parties to help me, even in areas that I might otherwise be able to do myself. So, you have to think about how you can hire others to help you with your business and grow your business. And obviously cash is king. That's a no duh. But there are other things that, you can think about and why you might want to talk to talent or get the right talent. And that usually is services. So, but there's others. Good talent can bring in leads, partnerships, vendors, strategic relationships. And, people don't just give that for free. They might want some sort of relationship, a long-term relationship or some other relationship that benefits them. Also, let's not forget intellectual property. So a lot of folks are building, amazing things right from their home, and they might need developers to help them with certain things, whether it's integrating with Google or Office 365 or doing your own thing. And so IP is a really important component, and sometimes you need talent to help you with that. So this is the sort of the cycle or circle that I think a lot of businesses are in. You need to get talent, but in order to get talent, you need money. In order to get investors, you need a competitive offering. In order to have a competitive offering, you need your talent. And so there's this vicious circle that prevents many business owners from getting off the ground and getting funding or getting talent. And so the key to this is to figure out, what kind of talent you need, number one, and then two, how do you entice that talent with what you have at your disposal with the company? And what I mean by that is, if you have the cash, this is not a big deal, but very few businesses and companies have the cash. And so you want to think of other ways or options you can entice talent to work for you. But it's not just simply saying, oh, I can throw equity at people. That's not enough. You need to look a little bit more carefully. You need to really understand the type of talent that one would, find that appealing, and then two, be able to actually do it. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But one of the ways would be to pay them in the future, right? So you are basically asking them to loan you something, their time, their resources, their IP, their connections. And what you're going to say is, well, I promise you, once I get this company going, I will pay you in the future. And there's different ways to do that, right? You give them, it would be like a loan or a promissory note. And you need to be fairly specific about that. We'll talk about some of these things later and how you document something like that. But another option is to give them equity or partial ownership in the company. But there's other pieces of that puzzle. You could give them an option to acquire ownership in the company in the future. Instead of giving them ownership now, you give them ownership later. And there are some benefits to that I'll discuss in a few minutes. But there's even other things. You can treat their contributions as a loan, and then, of course, pay them in the future, as I had mentioned. But there's all of these are tools in your bag of options to figure out the right talent or people to bring onto the company. And let me explain what I mean by that. You have company capabilities, right? You might have a little bit of cash, you have equity, you have a vision, a goal, but you have to match it to the right people. And the people, the talent, have their own issues and needs and concerns. And so the trick is to really understand that. And so I'm going to talk about some of that for a moment. And so now let's just, instead of us talking about it from the standpoint of owning a company, let's talk about it from the standpoint of we are the talent and we're thinking about joining a company. And the first thing that comes to mind, right, is reimbursement. Do we, do we get reimbursed right away? Do we get reimbursed later in the long term? Can I afford to give my time away to a company that may not be able to pay me back right now, or even worse, may never be able to pay me back if the business model doesn't come to fruition? So that is a really important piece to this, isn't it? If I am living day to day and I don't have a lot of resources and funds, then you probably don't want me to come on board full time and work for free, because I'm going to be, really nervous. I'm going to be maybe sidetracked working on other things, trying to feed my family and put food on the table. There's another piece of this, risk adversity. Businesses, if they're not done right, or if there's mistakes made or other problems, can create what's called personal liability. And different people have different thoughts on this. I am a lawyer. I do business with businesses, and it's really important to have a squeaky clean reputation. And so when somebody comes to me and says, hey, I want you to, help me start up a cannabis business, well, that makes me nervous. Even now with the changes in New Mexico law, it's still a problem for the feds. So I, as an attorney, don't, I'm not very I got some risk issues when we're talking about cannabis, for example, in my doing personal work for somebody. Other people are going to feel very differently about that. And, or if it's nothing controversial like cannabis, it's just any kind of business, but maybe it involves certain types of licensing, or maybe, it involves internet stuff that can create problems, copyright problems. There's a whole host of issues that I might have a concern about versus somebody else. And you need to make sure that you find the right person and talent that meets the risk adverse issues associated with the business. And likewise, you as a business owner are a component to this. If this is a risky business and I feel like you're cutting corners, it's probably not something I'm going to be interested in. So you got to match that up properly. Other one is time to devote, to the attention to the company. Do you need somebody full-time or part-time? If you need somebody full-time, do they have the ability to do so? Visibility. This is a big issue, believe it or not. A lot of talent out there already has a job or relationships, and they may like you, they may like your concept, but in order to help you, that might then create some visibility issues for them with their existing relationships. And you have to understand how that might relate. So for example, if you wanted to hire somebody to make introductions, strategic relationships, but they're concerned about their relationship to your company, red flag. It's not going to work. You need somebody that is not concerned about those issues. Tax concerns. This actually affects a lot of people as well. And so if you are talking to some talent and they don't like to futz around with their taxes, having to give them a K-1 every year is a monumental problem for some people. So you may want to steer clear of options that require a K-1. Such as equity. Instead, maybe an option for equity in the future would be a possibility. Other thing is the status of contributions. And what I mean by this is, is there intellectual property? Is there stuff that it can be considered an asset almost, that would be handed off to the company, and then, does it come back from the company? And, I'll give you two examples. One would be like IP or software. If I'm a web developer and I'm going to write some software for you, Do I care about that software such that if the company doesn't make it, I want the license back? Or am I going to license the software versus give and assign ownership of the software to the company? Is that okay? Another example would be, maybe an expensive piece of equipment. If you are maybe maybe you're a bricklayer and we're, building, brick buildings, and I happen to have a very robust trailer that we're going to use. Is that my asset, or am I selling it to the company? And is the company then going to take it? And does it give it back to me if it can't afford to pay me later? You got to think about those contributions and what the company needs versus what the talent wants. And going back to IP for a moment, if you say, I'm trying to find investors, well, I promise you, investors want the company to own the IP, the intellectual property. So if you hire talent that is not willing to assign the IP to the company, instead, they're only allowing the company to use it or license it, that's not going to go over very well with investors. And so you want to hire the right talent that is willing to assign and give the IP to the company so that the company then will appeal to investors. So the goal here really is to kind of match what the company wants and needs with the right talent. It's in the picture here, it's trying to get a round peg into a round hole. And if you have some talent that doesn't want to give IP away, or doesn't have the time or the money to devote to the company, they may be great at what you need from a hard skills perspective, but they're going to be terrible from the other perspective. So you really need to get a match, not just on the hard skills, the specific talent you're looking for, but you want to find somebody that meets the capabilities and needs of the company. And you're going to find those people because that's what you're looking for. You're going to kind of screen people to make sure they fit what the company can deliver. So, for example, if the talent doesn't have any cash, they're probably not going to be able to afford to be paid later. And why is that important? It's important because they are going to go and find other jobs. They're going to be distracted. They're going to have not a lot of patience to test the waters. They're going to tend to want to take those options or those steps, those actions that might get money into the company, although might not be great strategic decisions down the road. So they're not going to be a great match for the company. If they have a full-time job elsewhere, then that means they're not going to be able to devote much time to the company. If they have a full-time job somewhere and they have small children, forget about it. Don't even try. It's not going to work, even under the best of circumstances and with the best of intentions. If they have the talent has IP, intellectual property, licensed to other companies, well, then they're not going to be able to assign ownership to you and your company unless they're assigning over the licenses as well. So that might be a big issue for you if you're trying to obtain VC funding, like I had mentioned earlier. The other interesting thing that I see a lot of businesses overlook is this issue with non-compete and confidentiality agreements. So it's really interesting to me because if you're looking for somebody to help introduce you to clients or customers or strategic relationships, and they happen to be a mover or shaker at some other big company somewhere, the chances are they may have a non-compete, a non-solicitation, or a confidentiality agreement that might restrict some of their behavior or what they're able to do for you. And if they do, and you hire that person knowing about the contract, the business could be potentially liable to the other party, the other company, the larger company, for what's called tortious interference or contractual relations. So you really need to be careful about those strategic talent people, the sales executives, the movers and shakers that are going to introduce you to people, you really got to make sure that they have no restrictions under their existing contracts and that it's not going to affect your company or business. And then finally, this is the big one. This is a real big one. And that is, do you, as a business owner, value the contributions that the talent's making to the same level that the talent does? And let me explain what I mean by that. Let's say I'm going to use my two examples where I talked about software and a trailer to carry bricks around. Let's talk about the trailer. If I'm going to give the trailer to the business, and what's the fair market value of the trailer? If it's easy to look up and we see that it's worth $1,000 and I agree as the talent, you agree as the business, it's $1,000 as my contribution to the business. That's great because there's no dispute here. So if I want my trailer back, you can either give me my trailer or you can give me the $1,000. It's not a dispute. But suppose I think the trailer's worth $10,000 and you think the trailer's worth $1,000. Now we have a big problem here, right? Because you still need the trailer. You're desperate for the trailer. I give you the trailer. But now for some reason, you can't return the trailer back to me for some reason. Gets in an accident, it gets stolen. You sell the company and the trailer's listed as part of the assets. And I say, that's $10,000. And you say, that's ridiculous. It's only $1,000. Now we're disputing. Now we're fighting. And you don't want to be in that situation. So you really owe it to yourself to establish what the value of my contribution is before I lend you the trailer. Intellectual property is even worse because it's a bit amorphous. It's harder to figure out value. So you kind of want to negotiate something with me if I'm providing intellectual property or you're hiring somebody to do so. And you want to establish what the dollar amounts mean so that at the end of whatever period is relevant here, 6 months, 3 years, what is my expectation? I donated through my hard work, sweat equity, $100,000 worth of software for the company. And so that is my expectation after that period of time. I want to be paid. I want equity equivalent to that. I want something, and if I don't get it, I'm going to make your life really difficult. So you don't want to take something from talent, from an individual, and incorporate it into your company without it being crystal clear how much it's worth and how much it's going to tie into your business and whether it comes back or not to the talent. So let's talk about the different options we have available for remuneration for talent other than cash. That's an obvious one. And if you have bucket loads of it, that's great. But most people don't. So the very first thing most people talk about is equity ownership. And equity ownership means that you own part of the company. The word equity and ownership are almost synonyms, but equity means the value or the ownership interest in a company, and ownership just means you own it. But there's different types of equity or ownership interest. And the two biggies are economic interest versus voting interest. And you'll see different names for these things depending on who you're talking to. But for instance, sometimes you'll see non-voting interest versus founder interest. But at the end of the day, what we care about is economic non-voting versus voting interest. And the economic interest is interesting because there are a lot of businesses, and maybe your business, where you don't want people to actually be able to make decisions, but you want to give them some skin in the game without the ability to weigh in and vote or control in the company, or take some control in the company. And economic interest is great because when you have an ownership interest in the company, if there's any profits or losses, they flow through to the owners, depending on the tax status of the company. And if there are profits, you can have what's called distributions, and they are taxed at a lower rate than ordinary income. So when you say, oh, I'll give you a percentage of profits, well, that isn't as valuable to somebody as equity is, because equity will come to you and have less tax basis in certain situations and circumstances. The equity side, though, is, do I get a right to vote or not? And it's called levels. You can have different levels. And we can go into the tax issues on all of this ad nauseum, and it's a little bit outside the scope of this presentation today. But how you decide to do this will have tax implications. So you do need to talk to a tax professional, tax attorney, CPA, to understand what those tax implications are. But you need to understand that economic interest has problems for those owners, for the economic interest owners. And this is what the issues are. At the end of the day, you are trusting the voting owners to make the right decisions, to not create conflicts of interest between themselves and the economic interest folks. They could, for instance, vote themselves bonuses such that there's no profits for the economic interest only owners. They can lose their IP rights if they're not careful. So the economic interest owners really are putting a lot of faith and trust in the voting owners. And, that comes with a price. If you were asking me, the lawyer, to help your company out and you're willing to give me a economic interest ownership in your company, I'm not so interested in that. That's not so interesting to me, just because I want to be able to steer the boat or to create some, influence in where the company goes and how it does things. So the other issue with equity is what's called dilution, especially when you're early in the game. And if anybody's watched The Social Network, the movie, and there's a big part in it where, the former founders, one of them, I forget the guy's name, is suing because his ownership interest was greatly reduced to like fractions of a percent, and everybody else's wasn't. So dilution means the following. If you and I are in business together, we own 50% of the company. If we bring in another owner and we want, they want as much ownership as we do, well, when you have two 50%, that's 100%. You can never go beyond 100%. So if you bring in a third partner, how can you have three partners each owning an equal amount with 100%? The answer is everybody owns 33 1/3%. Well, that means my 50% went down to 33 1/3%. That's what dilution is. And if you keep adding owners over time, that 33% keeps going down, right? 50% to 33% to 25% to 20%. That's what happens when you keep bringing people in. So that's what dilution is all about. And the goal, though, is hopefully the company's growing. So when we start the company, what is 100% worth? Zero. So 50% of zero is zero. But in a year from now, maybe we bring in that third person. Now I own a third of the company, but it's now worth $1 million. So a third of $1 million is $330,000, which is a heck of a lot better than zero at 50%. So that's the goal with growing a company and having equity and experiencing dilution. So what are the pros and cons of equity ownership from the talent's perspective? And it's what I've listed here. Distributions and profit sharing can be taxed at a lower rate than what ordinary income is taxed in certain circumstances. And ideally, the company's increasing over time. So my interest, my value that I have in the company is going to increase over time. But remember, we have dilution, and that can be an issue, especially if we're bringing in a lot of owners and the company isn't growing as fast. The other thing is, it's almost like I analogize it to planting seeds. You're not going to get a growing crop without planting the seeds in the ground. And that's what this is all about. So you're starting a company, and hopefully it's going to grow over a few years, and you have an asset that you might be proud of or helps contribute to your overall wealth. And then finally, of course, is if it does sell and does grow, you might have that quote unquote exit someday, which would be a windfall possibly if it were to go public or sell it to a third party. So there's a lot of benefits there to equity ownership that's very appealing to people. However, there's a lot of downsides here for the talent or somebody like me. And I mentioned some of them earlier already. One is, if it's a pass-through entity for tax purposes, we have a K-1, and that complicates my personal tax situation. The other interesting thing here is, and a lot of people don't understand this, but profits don't necessarily equate to cash in my pocket. So if a company, and I'm making up numbers here, but if a company has $100,000 of profits, 50% of it is attributable to me, that $50,000 in profits goes on my personal income tax form, and who pays taxes on it? I do. I pay taxes on that $50,000. But if it's a growing company, we're probably taking that money and sinking it back into the company and maybe hiring more people, buying a trailer, painting the place, putting a new sign up. So we don't have the cash, the $50,000 that we say are profits. So I run the risk of having to pay taxes to the IRS for cash that I actually never get. So that could be a problem, especially for high growth companies and companies that are reinvesting the money back in the company. You got profits, but you have no cash coming back to the owners. The other thing I mentioned about earlier was personal liability. If you're an owner of the company and the company does something stupid, though, that can attach to you personally. And I mentioned cannabis. That'd be a great example. I think the chance of the feds coming down hard on cannabis companies is probably gone. But about 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, that was a real issue. It was a big question whether the feds were going to come knocking on, cannabis companies and shutting them down. And guess what? Those cannabis companies are a criminal enterprise as far as the feds are concerned. So do you think that has personal liability? You bet it does. And so being an investor, even a passive silent investor, could still be a tremendous personal liability problem for people. The other issue is most businesses fail after 3 years. The SBA has some crazy statistics, and I think it's lowered since the last time I've seen it, but it used to be in the low 90s. Within 3 years, most businesses would fail within 3 years. And it was like a 92% chance. And I think that's dropped a little bit now. I think it's in the 80s, but it's still an outrageously large number. And that is always a risk when you're working for equity. You may never get paid is the issue. And then remember, I talked about dilution. If we're going to be bringing in a lot of other owners, that means my ownership interest is going to go down significantly. And I'm going to evaluate that based on how much I think the company is going to grow. So you have to think about those issues from the talent perspective if you're going to be able to pitch something that is going to be interesting to the talent that you want to hire. But there are other options, and I'm going to be using the word option a lot here, and I got to be careful to not confuse you because I get my own self confused. But I'm talking about an option to acquire an equity interest. So that says, if you were going to grant it to me, what you basically say is look, I'm going to give you the option to take ownership at some point in the future, but you want me to stick around for 3 years. You have certain conditions that have to be met. And if we meet those conditions, then I can exercise my option and take equity ownership of the company. So it's really the same thing as equity ownership that I discussed above, except I don't get ownership immediately. It's given in the future at the option of the optionee, the person you are giving this option to. And there's some really interesting benefits here for this. One of them is it reduces the chance of personal liability. They're not an owner. They're not an owner until the option is exercised. That also means no dealing with tax issues, less headache, less loss potential. All of that goes away because you don't own the company. You don't have to deal with any of that. But if the company succeeds and we reach the milestones that we've all agreed to, that option can then be exercised and ownership can be taken. The cons or the downsides on this, though, is it could have unintended tax consequences, especially if the price I'm paying for that exercise doesn't match the fair market value. And I'll give you a quick example because it's confusing. But let's say you start a company today and you want me, the lawyer, to help you. But I don't want an ownership interest now. But I say, hey, I'll take an option for 10% if this thing grows the way I think it does in 3 years and I'm still around. You say, okay. So we think the company's worth zero. You're willing to give me the option to acquire 10% of the company, let's say for $1. And 3 years from now, that company becomes very well off. Let's say it's a $10 million company in 3 years. We should be so lucky. So now I knock on the door and say, I want to exercise my option. Please give me 10% of the $10 million company, right? What is 10% of that? $1 million. So you're giving me $1 million worth of ownership and I'm just paying you $1. Well, guess what? The IRS has something to say about that, as you might imagine. And it's almost, there are some rules and nuances to this and exceptions, but in general, it's almost like somebody giving you $1 million of Apple stock. Do you have to pay taxes on that as ordinary income? You betcha. So you want to think about how you deal with that so that you're not paying the IRS for a bunch of paper. Because if I get 10% of a private company valued at $1 million, well, I have to pay taxes on that, even though I don't have a successful exit yet. So there are some potential financial concerns if they're not dealt with carefully. The other thing is, there could be less reward. If I wait to take ownership until 3 years down the line, I may have to take less than I could have had I done it in the beginning. However, there's also ways to write this where I could say, no, I'm going to get 10% no matter what. So we may think we're only going to have 3 or 4 owners at, year 0. We think we'll have 3 or 4 owners in year 3. But when we actually get to year 3, we have 20 owners. But I still get my 10%. So it could really work either way, depending on how it's structured. So that con that I have could be a pro or a benefit, depending on how it's legally structured. So there's even a better one here for the talent, and that is the option to acquire an equity ownership with a conversion option. So I got the word option in here twice and it's confusing. But basically, it's the same option to acquire an equity ownership, but instead of getting equity, I could ask for cash. So I have the ability to choose if you were granting it to me. I have the option to acquire equity or just write me a check. Thank you very much. And there's benefits here, right? Because I get all those benefits of the option I talked about on the last slide, but if the company isn't going in the right direction, if I don't like the people, if my needs or interests change, I still am going to get remunerated. I can still get cash instead of the equity, and cash is king for some people. And it helps ensure that I'm going to get compensation, even if the company doesn't grow as much as we think it will. The only real con here is, or the problem is, if the company can't pay, then what are you going to do, right? So And you think about the logic there for a minute. If the company is going to have trouble paying me, what am I going to do? Squeeze blood out of a turnip? And if the company can afford to pay me, then it kind of sounds like maybe the company's successful. And so then why do I care about the cash? If the company's successful, I'm probably going to want equity, thinking or hoping that the company is going to continue to grow. The other issue is I may need a security interest. And a security interest is, think of it as like a lien on property so that I can ensure that I either get my assets or property back out of the company or that I'm able to get cash out if the company fails for some reason. So there could be some complexity with how you would perfect that if necessary and need be. And then finally, I want to talk about the loan, and that's an easy one, right? It's just, instead of ownership, your contributions are viewed as loans to the company. And I got to tell you, I see a lot of issues coming to my law firm because business owners get confused with the language and they'll talk about profits or ownership, and then they'll say, we'll pay you back. Well, when you say the words pay back, you're talking loan. You're not talking about an equity ownership or interest. So you got to be careful with your word choices, because if you were to tell Larry, the lawyer, oh yeah, we're going to give you 10% and we're going to make sure you get paid back. Well, guess what I'm thinking? I'm going to have equity ownership and you're going to pay me the money or whatever my contribution was. And you really don't mean that, because why on earth are you going to give an ownership interest in your company if you're going to pay somebody back for their contributions? You don't want to do that. It's like double paying for those contributions, whatever those were. So be very careful with your word choices and don't use the phrase pay back unless you intend to give a loan. Now, on the flip side, if I'm not a bank, so I'm not in the business of giving loans to people. So if you have a business and you're talking to me about, needing something from me, and then you want to pay me back someday, well, I'm not a bank. I'm not interested in that. And a lot of people aren't. So you got to kind of figure out how that's all going to work. And if you're really talking about loans, then go get an SBA loan and then go pay the talent the money using the loan or the money from the SBA. So what's the benefits here for something like this? Well, the value is negotiated. It would be agreed to, so it's a very specific number and hopefully you'll get paid. But, the con is, most of us aren't banks and, we're going to need some sort of security interest. And most people don't, they're not lawyers. They don't understand what that means. And so there's a really high risk that the company is going to fail and they're just not going to get paid. So loans aren't really that interesting to most people when we're talking about companies. Of course, if you have parents or family members, they're willing to do that, but you got to make sure you write that stuff down. So let's summarize this a little bit in terms of the value associated with these different options of remuneration that I mentioned. But you got to view it from a couple of different lenses. So first is, on the left side here is the greatest value to the company versus greatest value to the talent, the people that you're trying to get working for the company. Now, here's the big issue. We're starting at year zero. We have no idea whether the company is going to be successful or not. So if we can rub the crystal ball, look into the future and see if the company is going to be successful, then we know here's how these various options fit on this spectrum. The loan is going to be the greatest value to the company and the least value to the individual. The individual is going to make the most money and going to be most interested if the company is successful when they own equity or they have options to acquire equity. And so think about that for a minute. If you are a new company just starting up at year zero and you're trying to appeal to talent and you want them to jump on board, you really got to convince them that this is going to be a successful company. And how do you do that, right? You got to be able to appeal to not just your vision, but your ability to execute. and your ability to bring on the different resources and things or people necessary to affect that kind of execution. Now, on the flip side, if we look into the crystal ball 3 years from now and the company fails, what would be highest value to the different parties? Well, you see that the loan would be the best option if the company fails to the talent, and the equity is worthless, right? So that's the value to the company. But look here, option to acquire equity with a conversion option is the most value to the talent in both scenarios, whether the company is successful or the company fails. So that is valuable to the talent, the people you're talking to the investor. So don't give it away, right? Don't treat it as the same value as equity, because it's not. Equity is going to have a less of a premium on it than this will. And usually what's going to happen is you're going to be offering equity, and then you're going to meet somebody that's rather sophisticated, and they're going to throw this on there saying, oh, well, equity is great and all of that, but how about let's just make it an option, and I want a conversion option. And they're going to, kind of make it like after the fact, no big deal. Oh, it's a big deal, all right. And it is more valuable than just equity alone. So if you're going to do that, make sure you price it accordingly. And therefore, you expect more for offering something like that to whomever you're talking to. If it's an investor, you'd expect to value that at a different rate than you would just the equity alone. So I have a few parting thoughts, and then we'll open it up to any questions anybody has. I appreciate everybody's time thus far. But the first issue is finding talent that matches what the company can provide. And remember, it's not just finding somebody who has the skills you need. You need to find somebody that has the skills you need, plus the other pieces I talked about. If you can't pay them any money, then they need to not need money right away. If you're asking for leads or connections, intellectual property, ideas, you need to make sure that they don't have pre-existing relationships or, other duties or restrictions on that. Otherwise, that can affect your business. So you're going to find great people out there, but it's not going to be a match. Think the square peg and round hole, and you have to pass on. Do not force the square peg into the round hole. Make sure that the talent and the company agree on the value of the contributions. I gave you the example of a trailer where, you said it was worth $1,000. I say it's worth $10,000. You never want to be in the circumstance of having to debate that down the road. You will end up spending a lot of money on legal fees and possibly losing. So remember and appreciate the risk reward that your business offers, and use and value the remuneration appropriately. And I gave you that example of the conversion piece. That is a valuable thing to offer somebody, and it's more valuable than just equity alone. And so I would expect you to price those differently. And to give you an example of what I mean, let's say, I gave you an example of I was going to get 10% of a company in 3 years, and let's say I do $10,000 worth of work. Well, if you're going to give me a conversion option, maybe I don't get 10%, maybe I get 8%, because that's more valuable to me. Because it reduces my risk, I can still potentially get remunerated even though if the company's not doing very well. Remember, cash is king. Cash in the pocket today has a different value than promises of possible future riches. And you know this, right? It's called the future value of money. Money today is worth more getting paid today than it is down the road. And when we're talking about companies, new startups, we're talking about high risk, uncertainty. So it's just not worth what you think it is, down the road, and you should be aware of that. So I can't end this without talking about COVID-19 briefly. And the one thing that I think you need to take away from the pandemic is that the nature of work has changed somewhat. And while you see a lot of stuff in the news about some of the big titans, the tech titans, Google and Microsoft allowing people to work from home, that is not fully established. That is not a certainty. So if you're able to offer something like that to people, I think that's going to have a certain appeal. But, just don't offer it in a vacuum. You need to think about, does that meet your ability to manage the business and interact with others? And, as an example, we're looking for a high capable developer, a senior software developer. And we're going to, pay them a good amount of money. We sent out Indeed and Monster ads, and we're getting a lot of resumes from all over the world. But we really want to hire local here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And why is that? Because we want them to be able to come in and whiteboard with us. We don't have the right processes in place where they can just go to a queue and pull the next project or task off the list. We don't have that ability. They need to come in and strategize with us and define requirements with us. And so that's why we don't have the ability for this particular position to really do a true telemarketing or telecommute anywhere in the world. Although we might be willing to do a telecommute locally, long as they're able to come in on occasion. Finally, and this is the big one, never, ever, if you take one thing away from this presentation, it's this: never, ever make promises without the right contracts and paperwork. You just cannot do it. And think of my trailer example. If I'm thinking $10,000 in my head for a $1,000 trailer, and we never get the paperwork done on this, I'm going to fight for my full $10,000. You don't want to get in that situation. Why? Well, because if your company is successful, it's a huge target. There's all kinds of lawyers that are going to go after you and help the individual thinking that they've been ripped off their 50%. And you say you've never promised 50%, or you said you talked about 50%, but that was when the company was small, and then you guys never finalized anything. So you're not thinking 50% anymore, and you made other promises to other people. So now you're in a lot of trouble. You don't ever want to get in that situation. So you need to make sure and very clear in your emails and your communications, look, we do not have a deal until we sign on the dotted line. Here's what I'm thinking. And if this matches your thinking, we can, document this and we can get some paperwork drafted. But until both signatures are on the dotted line, it doesn't exist. You have to get that documented. And here's why that's important to you. Larry the lawyer, probably 30% of my revenue is associated with stuff like this, where promises were made or discussed between two or more partners, nothing got written down, and guess what? We're now fighting about it in the courts. And so we make a lot of money on that. And guess what? You know who wins these cases? It's those that have the money to fight it. And so if you don't have a lot of money to fight and pay for lawyers, then I think it's much better to get documents written instead of finding yourself in a big problem down the road.